2018 평창 겨울패럴림픽 이후 다시 겨울올림픽이 열린 해여서 더 뜻깊은 것 같습니다. 안녕하세요.
Good
2022 평창 장애
afternoon. I am the moderator of the first parallel session. My name is Kim Joo-hyun, and I'm the policy director of the Korea Association for the Human Rights of the Disabled with Brain Lesion. The theme of this session is the right to mobility in the life of the disabled people. We have 3 speakers and 3 panelists. Let me introduce them to you. First of all, we have with us Ms. Chung Da-woon, Director of the Policy Office Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. Next, Representative Kim Young-sup of the Gangwon Association of the Independent Living Centers. And last but not least, Ms. Laura Alciauskite, TRIPS Project Coordinator at the European Network on Independent Living. Our panelists are Representative Lim Kyung-mi of the Auckland Center of Independent Living, Chairman Lee Hyung-suk of the Seoul Council of Centers for Independent Living, and also Assistant Director Park Dong-guk of the Ministry of Land and Transportation. Because of the COVID situation, he is not able to join us today. Now, there are rallies ongoing at the subway stations, and this is by the people of disabilities. This is to let people know, especially the presidential hopefuls, for the importance of the rights to mobility. And one candidate had pledged for upholding the rights to mobility of the people with disabilities. And unfortunately, it took more than 20 years since the right to mobility of the people with disabilities gathered the attention of the public. The last time was back in 2001. With our struggle and protest, we were able to achieve a lot. Many changes were made, but we still have a lot to achieve. Yesterday, there was a ruling at the Supreme Court in relation to the lawsuit concerning the bus services, and the ruling was in support of the bus companies, unfortunately. I think that Ms. Chung Da-woon will be speaking on this. The first presentation will be given by Director Chung Da-woon.
So she'll be speaking for 15 minutes on the changes in tests after the revision of the Act on Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons. Hello, good afternoon. I will be speaking on the changes in tests after the revision of the Act on Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons. I am Chung Da-woon, Director of the Policy Office at the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. I will go right into my presentation. So we had the revision of this act passed at the National Assembly last December, and so there were some new stipulations added, and we were able to reflect many of the ideas, and we can expect further changes in the future. And in Gangwon and other provinces, a special transportation mode support will be provided, and this will be reflected in concrete budgets. And in this act, let's look at how this act had evolved over the years first, and then look at the specific contents and the specific tasks that we'll need to deal with in the future. So this act was enacted in January 27, 2005, and went into effect on January 28. And there was a Oi station accident involving death of a disabled person. And since then, there were several revisions to this act on promotion of the transportation convenience of mobility disadvantaged persons. So let's look at what the major revisions were. And there were some revisions on June 2012, and it was given as a responsibility for the governor to establish mobility support centers in the locality, and through this revision, the different local governments were required to expand the number of mobility support centers and also to remove any discrimination against the mobility rights of the disabled. And so the legal foundation was established. But despite these developments, the fact that the local communities were allowed to operate these centers, and the fact that they were given more budget, I mean, it just said that they can do these things, but it was not a mandatory requirement. And also the Metropolitan Mobility Support Center and the local support centers were to be established. But establishment is one thing, but then operations require additional costs. In the 2012 revisions, it only talks about the establishment, which means that there was a limitation with regards to securing sufficient budget. And next, we'll look at the 2018 revision that was in February. As for the contents of this revision, so from 2014, every time there was the Korean holidays coming up, there were some struggles engaged by the disabled to improve the right to mobility, and this led to the revision in 2019, and the expressway buses with wheelchair facilities were introduced. So that was the first revision which allowed for this improvement. In the case of the June 2018 revisions, it laid the legal foundation for leased taxis and voucher taxis. And this was just a part of the transportation policy. So it's not just for the wheelchair users, but the different vulnerable groups with regards to mobility and their rights were reflected. So that was the broad direction of these amendments. So there were three major amendments. And after that, there was the major revision, which took place in December of last year. So let's look at the contents of this revision. There are three major points to consider here, and the three have different implementation periods. So let's look at the buses. The mandatory introduction of low-floor buses, and this will be going into effect in January of next year. So if there are buses that go out of service because of old age, the newly introduced buses have to be mandatorily low-floor buses, and the mayors are operating the support centers for mobility, which became mandatory, and the central government support, financial support, will go into effect from July of next year. So what this implies is that the 2023 budget will have to be set from early this year and until next year. We need to continue to consult with the Ministry of Land and Transport to set the budget. And in September, it goes to the National Assembly for deliberations. And by December of this year, next year's budget will be determined. But the implementation period, according to law, is next year. And so the budget, how much of that budget will be reflected through this year's deliberations? That's going to affect the implementation, which will happen next year. So we will be able to reflect a realistic budget. So I think that will be an important point. And the enforcement decrees will also be developed and go into effect from next year. So will the opinions of the disabled people be reflected in the enforcement decrees? That's another major issue. So now let's look at the details in details. Two things. First is the low-floor buses. We have mandatory introduction of these buses, and it is stipulated under Article 14. I will explain the underlined part. So the transport operators, following the presidential decree, will have to introduce low-floor buses. So what this means is that if there are route-based buses, well, in fact, there are different types. There's metropolitan buses, city buses, intercity buses. So all of them to be translated or shifted to low-floor buses. That's not what it means. It's just what is designated, specifically designated through presidential decrees that will be mandatory. And among those also, there will be a lot of route exemptions because this is set by the presidential decree. And also among that, depending on the road conditions or the presence of different facilities necessary, there would be cases where low-floor buses cannot operate. And so through enforcement decree, if it is determined that it is impossible to have these low-floor buses, then exemptions can be granted. So we have the route buses. And I'm showing you the different types of buses. There are the city buses, the rural buses, town buses, and intercity buses. And of course, under each type, there are the specific seated ones, general ones, and the direct route buses. And it's not that all of these buses will have to have low-floor buses, but it is only when they fall under the enforcement decree that it will become mandatory. So I said that this has to go into effect from January of next year, but we can begin only with just a small proportion. The Ministry of Land and Transport internally already understands that the application scope will be very, very limited. So you will see the red checks on this screen. It's just the very small number of 3 different types of buses that will have to mandatorily introduce low-floor buses. And we don't have the specific enforcement decree yet, but there are reasons for this small scope. The Representative Chun Chun-ho, what he had proposed initially through the bill was to have mandatory low-floor buses for all different types, but the bill was passed in a format that enforcement decree takes precedence because the Ministry of Land determined that if there are buses that have safety belts, but then for city buses, you wouldn't have those. Of course, for expressways or highways, you would have the seated buses, but for the buses without the seat belts, or buses that have the seat belts, they do not have low-floor buses models available yet. And so they determined that they will have to introduce an enforcement decree which would limit the scope of the mandatory low-floor buses. And another thing to consider is that this enforcement decree covers the 3 types of buses, but even if all 3 buses are included as the scope, depending on the conditions, specific conditions, there can be exemptions given as well. Because, for example, if the road condition is unfavorable, that would require road construction work, which requires a long period of time. But so, if the law was passed or the bill was passed as is, then it would be impossible to enforce this law. And so they had to provide different exemptions. But of course, there will always be people who use this as an excuse, the road condition as an excuse to resist introducing low-floor buses. So it's important for us to have an assessment of the current state of the road systems, for example, and we need to establish specific plans for gradual introduction of the low-floor buses for all different types. And then there is the issues of changes that will follow the legal revisions, particularly with regards to the special or accessible transportation for the disabled. And we need to remove the discrimination. And to do that, there has to be national funding provided, and there has to be the single criteria or standardization of criteria that is applied. And this is an issue that we are really fighting with the government against. We are the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. We feel that this is very important. So there is the Ministry of Economy and Finance that's also in charge of the budget here. And so we are continuing to fight against them, because if you look at the specific stipulation in the amended law, it always says that an enforcement decree is required to receive financial support from the Ministry of Finance. And there's also, it is stated that there is a presidential decree requirement for the operations and consignment agencies designation. And it says, of course, these are major changes, but in each of the local communities, these responsibilities have been relegated. But since central government funding will be provided, its authority will be strengthened. And so this enforcement decree will be including all of these aspects. And so depending on the enforcement decree, the operations of the different local governments will be very varied and very different. And also on the guarantee of the metropolitan mobility rights, metropolitan mobility for the special or accessible transportation, and the linkages and transfer and integrated dispatch systems. These are the specific revisions that have been included. Of course, it's good that we had this amendment, but there are still tasks that we need to deal with in the future. So in the case of low-floor buses, for example, this is a mandatory stipulation, but it has a very narrow scope as a result. And so the scope of the buses, the mandatory buses, long-term wise will have to be expanded to include other types, and for more responsibility for the central government will be required, since the government will be intervening more because it provides funding. So the service quality has to be enhanced through wider services provision. And regardless of how much the budget is, we have to assess how this budget can be applied for efficiency improvement. So we need to negotiate the specifics of these with the government. And so our solidarity is trying to present some suggestions. I have only 1 minute left for my presentation. But anyhow, I did explain to you the background of this demand that we are making. And now I will go into the specifics of the demand. First of all, for the buses, we want to classify the urban and the rural buses, and also the intercity and metropolitan area buses. For the city, rural, and town buses, this has to do with mandatory requirement, but then depending on the road conditions, they may receive exemptions. And this may require road construction. And so that means that there has to be an assessment, a review of the current conditions. And the Ministry of Land will have to establish a plan to improve the road situation, and the budget should be reflected. And the fourth Mobility Convenience Promotion Plan will be introduced soon. And our solidarity is saying that we need to have a target of 50% for the rural area and town area bus, low-floor bus introductions. And also we are asking that there will be no discrimination against the use of these low-floor buses for the disabled. And there are, of course, for the intercity and metropolitan buses, they can be exempted. We cannot let the situation be as is. So I think the seat belt has been an important differentiating criteria with regards to whether it's mandatory or not. But how long will it take for these seated buses to have the low-floor buses technology developed so that we can eventually have all of the buses be low-floor? So in these cases, we are also asking for 50%. And there is the Sejong City B1 bus that is in operation. The company is in Daejeon, but its route, it goes between Chungbuk and Sejong area. So Chungbuk, Sejong, and Daejeon. Among the three cities, no one is taking responsibility for the introduction of low-floor buses for this route. And so for this specific route, we need a plan And next, for the central government support, financial support for the specialized transportation modes, we are asking that, well, in the case of the local governments, if there is a 70% rate of matching from the central government, then its authority can be strengthened further. And through the central government support, there could be expansion of these services. We could have the Ministry of Land exercise stronger responsibilities and do rights when it comes to setting the fare rate, for example. And also, the metropolitan mobility rights should be guaranteed as well. And for specialized transportation field, well, the wheelchair users in particular have to wait for a long time. And so we needed to diversify the different special modes to ensure that the waiting time for those who are using wheelchair be reduced. And our solidarity is saying that the special transportation modes operation costs, well, the 70% of the financial support will come from the central government to the local government. So there is a guarantee of 70% for the expense from the central government, which means that the local government has additional funding that it can exercise. And so we could have some voucher systems or other more diverse specialized transportation modes and services provided from the local governments. And I think there's a huge disparity among the different localities. I think we need to come up with specific solutions to address this problem as well. And in the case of subways, we needed to secure 2 more stations. And in the case of Seoul, most of the subway stations do have elevators, but in Seoul, the elevator rate is quite high. But in the metropolitan area subway system, there are sections where Korail is in charge and not the Seoul Metropolitan Corporation. In the Korail stations, there are many stations where the elevators have not been installed. And so the Ministry of Land is in charge, or the supervising ministry of Korail. And so the ministry has to step in to ensure that all stations will have elevators installed. So that is another specific demand that we are making. So in the interest of time, I do want to conclude by saying that we really welcome the amendment of this act, and there will be more tasks that we need to deal with to ensure that this act will be implemented in a very effective and efficient manner. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, we went over time a little bit. So you talked about this amendment to the act and the introduction of low-floor buses and the ways for us to secure more budget, mandatory steps that should be taken by the local governments and the Ministry of Land, and many other tasks was shared. So now we want to know about the different metropolitan area situation with regards to rights to mobility.
Let's listen to Mr. Kim Yong-sup of the Gangwon Association of the Independent Living Centers. I will give you 15 minutes. Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Kim Yong-sup of the Gangwon Association of Independent Living Centers. It has been already 4 years since the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympics were held. And based on the PyeongChang Winter Olympics in Gangwon Province, also there was heightened interest in the rights and the situations of people with disabilities, and also in the Gangwon Province as well. Up till then, people were not that interested in the Gangwon area. But people started to take interest in this area and also the issue of mobility. And with the hosting of the Paralympic Games, I think that there were increased interest in the issue of mobility and the rights of mobility. So today here at the PyeongChang Disability Forum, it is an honor for me to participate as a speaker. The next speaker will be Well, the previous speaker talked about the legal aspect, so I will be talking about the current status of the mobility of persons with disabilities and how it's reflected in policy. So I wrote here that Gangwon Province is a place where persons with disabilities can enjoy a good life. The right to mobility is a basic right, and the Gangwon provincial government, we held a press conference. That was back in April of 2005. Mayor Lee Jae-jun, who is the mayor of Chuncheon, he did not hold a public official office at that time. But back then, he held a public debate on the topic of, is Chuncheon City a place where people with disabilities can live a livable life? That's when we started to debate this topic. And also in Wonju, we started the signature campaign under the topic of people with disability want to ride buses. That was back in 2005. And also, I remember back then in 2007 when Wonju City started to implement the low-floor buses. I had first rode the low-floor bus, and I remember that I was very impressed with the buses. We implemented 2 units of low-floor buses back then. So also, electric wheelchairs were provided. It has not been long since we had introduced the electric wheelchairs, and with that, I understand that many people with disabilities were able to go out into society more, and we were able to promote the disability movement here in the Korean society. Let us take a look at the population of people with disability in Gangwon Province. The total population is 1.53 million, 8,492 in the Gangwon Province. The people with disability, they're over 100,000. I'm not sure what the population here of people with disability is in Seoul, but that's the case in Gangwon Province. Those with severe disabilities are 38,000, a little over that, and mild disabilities, 63,000. So let's talk about the low-floor buses. There are 18 cities and provinces in Gangwon Province. There are 256 low-floor buses in Gangwon Province. Chuncheon, Wonju, and Gangneung are where most of the low-floor buses are being operated. And among the 18 provinces and cities, 12 cities and buses 12 cities and provinces actually do not have low-floor buses. PyeongChang, where the Paralympics were held, did not have the low-floor buses. Now it has 2. Why is it that we only have 200 low-floor buses throughout Gangwon Province? We really have to think about this. Most of them are concentrated in Chuncheon and Wonju, and in the other cities and provinces, there are only 1 or 2 or 3. What are the challenges in terms of operating the low-floor buses? I think it's the same for different regions, but as it was mentioned by Director In Kyung-mi from Chungbuk, there are illegal parking at the bus stations for the low-floor buses. So that's one big challenge. And another challenge is that depending on the bus dispatch time, the bus drivers can be very aggressive. They're not that kind. So if you ride the low-floor bus, of course, the slope sometimes does not function properly. But once you ride the bus driver has to come and open up the chair for you and also guide the elderly and help those with electric wheelchairs to board the low-floor buses. So it takes a long time to ride the low-floor buses, and sometimes the buses do not function well, and among the 256 units, only 200 are operating in full. Also, those who ride the electric wheelchairs, well, they are eligible for using the special transportation methods. But if you look here at the units, the number of the special methods of transportation, there is a statutory special methods of transportation listed here, and the actual number of special methods of transportation in operation. You can see that the actual number of vehicles in operation does not meet the statutory number. And you can see most of them are located in Chuncheon and Wonju. The rest are only 2 or 3 units. Chuncheon, Wonju, Gangneung. There are some lease taxis that are operated here as well. Samcheok, you can see there are 10 statutory special vehicles allocated. Only 5 are being operated in actuality. So the statutory numbers are usually 6, 3. In terms of Hwacheon, the statutory number is 3, but the actual number that's being operated is 4. So the actual number exceeds the statutory number, which is impressive. Luckily, I believe it's lucky, in Gangwon province, well, there has been continuous protests and demands. And so we have these special methods of transportation being operated 365 days a year and 24/7. However, if you want to go and transport in a wide area, you have to make a reservation 1 day before. And what's also noteworthy is that for the recipients of Basic Livelihood Security Program, the highway toll gate fees are supported by the local municipality. Gangwon province utilizes the lottery money. For example, Chuncheon, Gangneung, and Wonju, to support this special method of transportation. But anyhow, if you look at Sokcho and the other local municipalities, the wide area transportation is limited to 2 times per day. Especially for Sokcho City, there is no train infrastructure. So for those who reside in Sokcho, there are no buses that transport throughout the wide area. So if 1 or 2 people utilizes special vehicles for transportation, then the remaining people would not be able to go outside of the Sokcho area. So this is indeed a challenge. And another issue, well, there was the abolition of the disability rating system, but with that, the statutory number of special methods of transportation has increased, but the number of users have also increased as well. And that has led to an increase in the wait time for using these vehicles. Now, in the Act for the mobility, the Act on Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons, the users has been identified, and so there has been an increase of the number of users of these special methods of transportation. And I did a survey, and I could see that also, if you look at the land area of the local municipalities around the nation, Hongcheon County is number 1, Inje County's land area is number 2, and PyeongChang County's land area is number 4. The population is not that high, but the land area is large. So what does this mean? It has an implication for transportation. So Gangwon province, because the land area is large, it takes a long time to travel from one place to another. It's not because of the travel congestions, but because of the large land areas. We have to take this into consideration as well. So now let me talk about the challenges that we must tackle to make a Gangwon province where people with disabilities can live a happy life. We continue to make demands for improvement in the lives of people with disabilities. First, we need to make further improvements in terms of implementing the low-floor buses. With the PyeongChang Winter Olympics, we had at that time made a number of demands and changes in our society, but there were some that had not been accommodated. And one of that would be mandating the implementation of the low-floor buses. And also, there are regions where the low-floor buses are not yet in operation. And in those areas, we have to make sure that the mid-size, low-floor village shuttle buses should be operated. Also in Wonju City, we can see that the operator of the special method of transportation is a public entity. We should make all operators of these special modes of transportation be public entities. So we should make sure that the mobility rights of people with disability in terms of express buses and intercity buses should be ensured. And also, we need to establish the mobility support centers for the wide area support. This was also mentioned by the previous speaker. Also, for the operation of the leased taxis has to be promoted to ensure that more people can utilize this. In the case of Wonju City, the leased taxis are limited to the use by people with visual disabilities, but the people who are eligible for this service to be further broadened and expanded to include other types of disabilities. And also, we should implement lift buses for group transportations. We had made this demand too with the Gangwon provincial government. And the response that we received was that the drivers that have been hired by the Gangwon provincial government do not have the right driver's license to accommodate buses with lifts. So I do hope that we can make this happen. Now, while we were hosting the Olympics, Gangwon province had bought 2 buses, but we are not being able to utilize the infrastructure that we have well. So we will continue to make these demands continuously. This is a declaration to ensure the right to mobility and independent living of the disabled in Gangwon province so that they can move out of the facilities. This is a declaration by the Gangwon governor, Mr. Choi Moon-sun. And based on this, we will continue to push for ensuring the right to mobility of the people with disability here in Gangwon province. So this is my view. I'm sure that you all agree with me, but securing the right to mobility enables the people with disabilities to lead their own lives, live an independent life, instead of having people make decisions for them. This was mentioned by Mr. Park Kyung-suk yesterday as well. But in order to be guaranteed the right to pursue the dignity, value, and happiness as a human being, mobility disadvantaged persons shall have the right to use safely, conveniently, and without discrimination all means of transportation, passenger facilities, and roads used by persons other than the mobility disadvantaged persons. This is the definition of right to mobility stipulated in our law. Gangwon-do, which advocates for a city where citizens are the owners, places the elderly women and children above others, and is the most livable city for the disabled, where labor is respected and treats workers with respect, is a place where the right to mobility for persons with disabilities is secured and barrier-free and universal design for all, and not some, is satisfied. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Kim Young-seok. You talked about how heightened interest has been placed on Gangwon-do after the PyeongChang Olympics and also some of the challenges ahead. I do hope that a wide area mobility support center can be introduced here in Gangwon-do and more transportation infrastructure can be introduced.
Let's now look at an overseas example. In Europe, they have a TRIPS project going on the future mobility solutions. So the coordinator of the TRIPS project is Laura Alciauskaite. So let us listen to her presentation. You have 15 minutes. Please stick to your time limit.
Alciauskaite, and I represent European Network on Independent Living, which is one of the largest networks in Europe, uniting persons with disabilities and organizations which work with persons with disabilities. I was invited here today to share some insights about the TRIPS project, one of the projects we currently are working on, and to tell you about the role of persons with disabilities in the process of creating accessible future mobility solutions. According to the statistics, there are over 42 million people who are considered having a disability in the world, and it is more than 10% of the general population. According to the social model of disability, disability is understood as the result of the interaction between persons' impairment and various barriers in society, which hinder full and equal participation in all important areas of life. One of these areas is traveling, and therefore, inaccessible public transport limits the equal access to important services, job opportunities, education, overall lifestyle choices, and doesn't ensure the right to independent living. Now, let me introduce who works in the TRIPS project. We have 11 partners on board from more than 13 countries. Besides European Network on Independent Living, we work with many people coming from different fields, starting from the university, to research center, to companies of transport providers and assistive technology suppliers. Our main activities of the project are taking place in 7 European cities, which are Stockholm, Brussels, Lisbon, Cagliari, Bologna, Zagreb, and Sofia. Here you can see the project objectives. Our first objective is to understand the needs and attitudes of persons with disabilities toward future mobility as a means for designing inclusive mobility solutions. Our second objective is to review the state of the art and future trends in mobility, assistive technologies, and digital trends relating to mobility to identify gaps. The third objective of the project is to develop and test the co-design for all methodology and enable equal access to open innovations to all citizens. And finally, our fourth objective is to engage disabled citizens and institutional actors in developing policy recommendations, research priorities, and industry roadmap. Here you can see the methodology of the project. It all starts with the identification of barriers and derivation of user requirements. Then we review the existing mobility trends, assistive systems, information, and communication. In the meantime, we work on the development of the Mobility Divide Index, which is a tool to measure the accessibility of various means of public transportation. During the whole project, we are working on the development of the co-design for all approach and methodology. One of the main goals of the project is designing and developing the chosen mobility solutions in each of the project cities. And finally, by the end of the project, we want to prepare policy and industry recommendations. Now, I will briefly talk about what is the role of the persons with disabilities in this process of our project. First of all, they led the formation of the local groups in 7 project cities, which I already mentioned earlier. These groups contain from 10 to 15 people, including persons with different types of disabilities and access needs, transport providers, representatives of city municipalities, and academics. Each of the groups is led by the local user leads, who are, in most cases, disabled persons themselves or disability-related activists. The group of persons with disabilities who are working in the project is called the core user team, and their role is to ensure that all needs are put into consideration while developing the future mobility solutions, and that we work in the co-design approach during the whole project. Each project city has their own local user lead and core user team. The local user leads and the core user teams contributed a lot to implementing the qualitative research, which contains 2 parts: social media content analysis and semi-structured interviews. Social media content analysis aimed to identify the barriers that people with disabilities face while traveling with public transportation. The content was collected from disabled persons' point of view on social media sources, such as Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and others. Each local user lead has collected 30 social media entries. Also, each local user lead conducted 7 interviews to acquire in-depth information and insights regarding barriers in mobility in the project cities. The results of the qualitative research are presented in the report, which can be found in our project website. In the project, besides the qualitative research, we also created the quantitative survey, which aimed to collect disabled users' familiarity and attitudes towards digital technologies, smart assistive technologies, and 9 types of mobility solutions. The local user leads and the core user teams helped us a lot with the dissemination of the survey, and therefore we managed to collect the views of 553 persons with different types of disabilities living in Europe. The results of the survey are presented in the white paper, which can also be found on our project website. As I mentioned before, in the project, we are working in a co-design way. Co-design is based on the idea that we can come together and collaboratively create new ideas and concepts. In this process, everyone is perceived as an expert of their own field and shares their knowledge, skills, and resources with others. This also means everyone shares equal responsibility for making the process successful. Traditionally, in many projects, persons with disabilities are considered only volunteers, and they don't have equal responsibilities or abilities to make decisions. In co-design, all participants are equal partners in the process, with equal power of decision-making. So it means that everyone in the co-design group, including persons with disabilities, are compensated for their time and work. With a qualitative research, the local user leads and core user teams identified barriers of public transportation in the cities. And currently, the local teams are working on designing the mobility solutions to tackle these barriers. Before this, they implement the user experience research, which help the local teams to identify the exact needs of users with different disabilities. In addition, the persons with disabilities keep on leading the co-design workshops, where the local teams will define prototypes of their mobility solutions and will get them tested in the end. And finally, what are the next steps in this project? The local teams will keep on working on designing, developing, and testing the mobility solutions they have picked in their cities. Once they are done with this, they will apply the mobility divide index to assess the accessibility of these new mobility solutions. And finally, the local teams will work on dissemination of the project results and will implement their findings and experience into policy recommendations. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for inviting me to your beautiful event. Unfortunately, I was not able to connect to the event live. But if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to contact me by my email provided here. Thank you once again, and I wish you to have a nice rest of the forum. Goodbye.
트립스 프로그램
Thank you very much for the presentation on TRIPS project and the role of the disabled. So various stakeholders can come together to develop future mobility solutions, which is an impressive example. So I'd like to thank the three speakers. On the three presentations, we will now go on to the panel discussion session. I'll be giving 5 minutes each to each panelist, and then we'll be listening to the answers from the three presenters or two presenters, and then I will give the panelists another opportunity to speak. So I'm not really familiar with the how to proceed as a moderator, so I ask you for your understanding. I'd like to invite Im Kyung-mi from the Auckland Center of Independent Living first.
Yes, good afternoon. I am Lee Kyung-mi, representative of the Auckland Center of Independent Living. Today I am here before you because I want to achieve the freedom of mobility, and I think that is what all people with disabilities aspire. It has been 21 years since we have been calling for the right of mobility. But nevertheless, we are still not able to enjoy the freedom of mobility. In 2021, the Act on the Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility of Disadvantaged Persons was amended. When the amendment was announced, I had hope, a little bit of hope, and there were some good points about this. But at the same time, there are some challenges ahead. I live in the rural area, and so I have greater challenges when it comes to mobility. The only means of transportation is a special means of transportation and the railroad, the train. There's no subway, and also there's no low-floor buses, even if it's only 20 to 30% penetration rate. And there's only one low-floor bus in Auckland. Therefore, mobility is truly limited in the place where I live. Can't you just imagine how it is? The special means of transportation has been adopted, but still there are so many challenges for me. They say that it's operated 24/7, 365 days a year. But you have to make a reservation by 10 o'clock at night. And in some areas, when it becomes 9:30 p.m., it no longer operates. So it's like Cinderella. At least Cinderella had time up till midnight. But we are given time only up to 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. We are living in the 21st century, but nevertheless, when it comes to mobility, we are lacking. And in Seoul, we have the rallies at the subway stations. This is because we want to continue this rally. Despite what we experience, the clashes with the citizens is because we want the freedom of mobility. Just because we have disability does not mean that we are not human beings. We keep on saying that we are human beings. We want to live a dignified life. We have the right to enjoy happiness, like it was mentioned by Mr. Kim. We have the right to enjoy happiness. We have the right to mobility. There are the laws. There's the Constitution. There is the Act on Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons. There is the law. But we do not have freedom of mobility. Why is it so? We continue to ask this question. And the government says to us, whenever we ask this question, what do you think they tell us? What do you think the government says? Whether it's a local government or the central government, they keep on saying the same thing. It's an issue of budget. So, if it's a matter of budget, if you look at Chungcheongbuk-do, In order to create a wide area train, hundreds of billions of won is being inputted. And I saw the slogan, and I was really hurt after I read the slogan. The slogan said, I will going to have lunch at Daejeon. So just to have lunch and to enjoy happiness, they are building that wide area train. So from Chungbuk, they go to Daejeon, they eat lunch and they come back just to have lunch. But in our case, we still cannot enjoy the freedom of mobility, and therefore we cannot receive education. We cannot commute to work. If we want to go to work, we have to ask for the understanding of our employer because we will be late every day, an hour late. And if it's for cultural services, the same. At the center, we want to go on a picnic because it's spring now, right? We want to go outside. We want to go to the picnic with our colleagues, but we have no transportation that can take us as a group. We have 2 or 1 transportation vehicles. So in order for all of us to go together, then we have to go back and forth at least 20 times. So the whole day is used moving back and forth. Why is it that we have the law, but the law is not implemented? As it was mentioned by Director Chung Da-un, the enforcement decree and the law is not being implemented in the right manner. That is why we have the laws, but just making the laws is not enough. I think that does not make sense. And another issue, the special means of transportation is solely believed to be the responsibility of the municipalities. So some municipalities have the special means of transportation. So in the Chungcheong area, there's no wide area center. We had massive protests, and the response was that at the end of this year, they will build us a center. We have an ordinance now, but in order to actually execute this, in order to actually build a center, what we need is not an ordinance, but we need the actual actions at the scene in reality. Your time is up. Please wrap up. Yes, I understand. So I think that this is all reflected in budget. As long as we do not have the central government's budget and support, then we will not be able to build the infrastructure in the local areas, and then more people with disability will not be able to come out of their homes and go into society. So since we have the representative and the Minister of Transportation, I think that we need more support from the central government. You need to do more. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. He talked about the difficulties of mobility at the rural areas. Ms. Lee Kyung-mi, thank you very much. I was supposed to give you 7 minutes, but we are out of time, so I think I have to limit your words to 5 minutes.
Next, I'd like to invite Lee Hyung-Sook, Chairman of the Seoul Council of Centers for Independent Living. You have 5 minutes. I don't think that will be enough time for me. But anyhow, I am working in Seoul City on the right to mobility for the disabled. So I'd like to talk about our situation right now. Mobility is directly linked to our daily lives. We have to be mobile to receive education, to be able to work, to earn money, to live in the local community. But that connection is severed, and that connection doesn't exist. Seoul probably in the country is the leader when it comes to mobility rights, and has been a leader for a long time. So you can say that on one hand. However, Seoul still has a long way to go in terms of improving the current situation. As we heard earlier, in 2015, Seoul made a declaration on the mobility rights. Specifically, it talked about the plans to be implemented to promote mobility rights as well. So that promise was made. First, the hot issue these days is the subway. In 2022 or by 2022, there has to be elevators installed in all stations. In the rural areas or other localities, they almost don't have any lifts because of the elevators. But in Seoul, in 22 subway stations, we still have the lifts. And the lift, as you know, anyone here who likes taking the wheelchair lift? No, no one. It's very, very dangerous to take the lift. Once you take it, you will never want to take the lift again. And so I believe that by this year, all of the subway stations will have to have elevators installed, but there's still 22 that don't have the elevators. Right to equality and includes right to safety and convenience. And so we heard earlier about the absence of or the existence of safety belts for the expressway buses, and that's used as an excuse for not adopting low-floor buses. So these are the kinds of reality that Seoul City is faced with right now. And there's the issue of buses. Nationally, Seoul probably has the most number of low-floor city buses right now. As of 2021, about 50% of the Seoul city buses are low floor, and this year's goal is to have 80%. And that was part of the implementation plan, but it was not reflected in the budget, and so we don't expect the plan to be implemented. So by 2025, Seoul aims to have a 100% low-floor buses for the city buses. But looking at the situation this year, by 2025, it's unlikely we will have 100% because even this year's promise was not kept. And the town buses or village buses also. In in Seoul, town buses are as important as the city buses. However, almost all of them do not have low-floor buses, which is a huge inconvenience for mobility rights of the disabled. And the press is often talking about the mobility rights, and it is being reported quite often. And some reporters often ask, so in Seoul, we have over 50% of the buses being low floor. So if you ask the bus operators, well, they say that the disabled people hardly use our buses. And there are some drivers who say, or some routes where there's not a single use by the disabled. So you have to ask why. And so this is my answer. So, what's the use of having 50% low floor buses if my destination or the destination that I'm thinking about doesn't have a low floor bus route? So, if I'm going to have to make transfer of buses, if to a certain point I can take the low floor bus, but when I transfer, there is no low floor bus. What's the use of that? And so unless we have 100% low floor buses, it'll be very difficult for the disabled to use these buses often. And it's the same for able people as well. And that is why we really need to speed up the process of transitioning to 100% low floor. Another issue that the media is interested in these days is why is it that the disabled people intentionally stick their wheelchairs to the doors of these subways, subway trains. And so if we intentionally have made these actions, then, well, these are actions that we can always undo. However, we oftentimes are being accused of doing actions with the intention of harming other people, but that is a misunderstanding. This problem of the screen door and the subway train gap, floor gap, is an issue that or a problem that the subway operators should resolve. It's not our responsibility. So these are the kinds of conversations and discussions that we continue to have with the Seoul City. I would like to talk about the act on the promotion of transportation convenience of mobility disadvantaged persons briefly. A few days ago, we had a meeting with Seoul City officials. And since there was an amendment to this act, well, what we are asking is that to have Seoul, Gyeonggi, Incheon areas, this wide area be connected. So from next year, this wide area connection will be available. And so we asked them, what are your specific plans to make this happen? What Seoul City has told us is that this act amendment has nothing to do with Seoul City. This is the responsibility of governors, but Seoul City doesn't have a governor. And the operations cost, we're not going to receive any funding, so the City Hall of Seoul cannot do anything about it. We are really concerned about these things happening, and they became a reality. So the operations expenses, according to Seoul City, is that there has to be at least 50% of central government funding provided for these plans or amendments to be implemented. And so that is the official answer from Seoul City. And I think that it will be similar for the other localities as well. And so we really need to continue to make these discussions to secure the needed funding from the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Last thing I want to mention is that with regards to mobility rights, well, Seoul City talked about the distance and time and the expense, the fee. It takes too long, so there is the issue of fare, and they talk about supply and demand. So if such a wide area transport or mobility service is provided, we already offer the taxi services for the disabled. There are 630 such taxis available right now. And what we are asking for is 830 units, which is 1.5 times the current level. So to have this wide area services provided, the distance, the route, and the fare system will have to be adjusted. This is according to Seoul City. But this is an issue that is directly linked to the lives of the disabled. But the city is always just nitpicking and talking about the money and the budget issue. So this year is going to be the turning point for us to make a change. So last year we had the amendment, and this year the local government, central government will have to establish the budget for actual implementation from next year. But based on what the local government has been saying so far, I don't think there will be much change in the future. So Seoul City, we are planning on a really fierce struggle this year, because in June 1st, we will have the local elections. A new Seoul mayor will be elected at that time. And so to secure our mobility rights, we're going to engage in fierce struggle, and we ask all of you here to join in our efforts. Mobility rights in Seoul. It has to be fully guaranteed, and that is going to set a good example for the other localities to follow and change along. And so this year, it will be the year for fierce struggle. So let us all be together in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee Kyung-suk. You used up a lot of time, but I let you continue because you were touching upon a very important point. Now I would like to invite Deputy Director Park Dong-guk of the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport. I will give you 5 minutes. Can you hear me? Yes. So let me begin. So today's session is about the mobility rights of people with disabilities. So important issues are included in the Act and promotion of the transportation convenience of mobility disadvantaged persons. And I think that this session's topic is very timely and appropriate as there has been an amendment. Let me summarize the amendment and also some of the challenges that was included in the presentations. If you look at the amendment of this act, in order to ensure the mobility right, we have included the establishment of the wide area mobility support service center, as well as the establishment of cable cars, for example, to ensure that amenities have been included for the mobility disadvantaged persons. First, to implement more low-floor buses, enforcement decrees will be implemented to ensure that there will be more such buses will be implemented, and also emergency systems and other technologies and systems will so that routes where the low floor buses cannot be implemented can ensure that alternative modes can be implemented. So alternative modes will be developed, and when they are developed in the wide areas, we will be reviewing the implementation of an enforcement decree for the adoption of such alternative modes. Also, for exceptions for the implementation of the low floor buses, we will be collecting opinions of the various groups to reflect different views. And when an exception is acknowledged, still, we will come up with a regulation on this so that low floor bus adoption will be carried out without issues. So within 10 years, we want to have also low-floor village shuttle buses so that we can have greater accessibility to the low-floor buses by the people with disabilities. Also, we want to improve the bus stops for these low-floor buses. Also, we want to provide education and awareness enhancement towards the people with disabilities so that services towards people with disabilities in terms of the low-floor buses can be improved. Also, for the B-type buses in Sejong City, which was mentioned, the government will be carrying out reviews in terms of funding and other matters. Also, for the wide area mobility support centers, well, in order for the support centers to be built, we have come up with legislative basis. However, in terms of the subsidies, this is not a mandatory regulation that has been put into place, and I'm sure that there is a lot of questions about this. Right now, we are reviewing this to ensure that the required budget is provided. MOLIT will do its utmost and carry out a review. Also, in terms of the operation time and the method, we will be coming up with a presidential decree so that we can have a greater operation time, so that we can have more people enjoy this service. And also in terms of the lease taxis, depending on the circumstances of the local municipalities. Of course, there are municipalities that have the service and those who do not have this. But in order to promote this service, we will look and review into how we can further provide financial support, and also in terms of implementing more amenities such as cable cars. Well, we did a survey, and we will continue to do such surveys to identify areas for further improvement. And also, in terms of the subway stations, most of the subway stations have one elevator per station. We will make sure that improvements are made so that the mobility disadvantaged persons can utilize the subway stations more conveniently. We will make sure that the next plan for the mobility disadvantaged person services can reflect your views so that we can ensure that more convenient services can be provided to the mobility disadvantaged persons, and also the challenges and the policy tax in terms of the amendment of the Act of Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons can be resolved. We will be making more efforts. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Deputy Director Park. Because he joined us by Zoom, we had some technical issues. We ask for your understanding. We thank all three panelists. Let's listen to the response by the three speakers. If you have any additional speakers, please raise your hand and I will give the opportunity to the speakers.
So the wide area buses, when will the R&D be completed? And the enforcement decree, which makes it mandatory, I mean, when will that happen? Yes, I don't think that's going to happen during the term of the deputy director, but when is it? I'd like to ask Mr. Park for the answer for future schedules. We have the plan is that we will have a pilot project by 2026, and after the pilot project, the specific plan, implementation plan, will be considered from 2026. So you're saying that the pilot project will be completed by 2026, and then the plans will be established afterwards? Is that how you see it's going to happen? Well, yes, we will try to speed it up, but as it stands right now, I think 2026 is the realistic deadline. But in the express bus terminals already, there are low floor buses that operate. Can't we just introduce those buses? It's just a question. I mean, I'm sure others are interested in this issue as well. So, yeah, I really want to know what. Yes, let me try to answer that. The buses are not low floor buses, but those are wheelchair enabled buses. So there's a difference between the two when it comes to the expressway buses that you were talking about. So we're really trying to introduce the more low floor buses, but the operators, it's difficult for us to find the operators that will be interested in doing this business. Oh, so it's a lift type of a bus for wheelchairs, right? Yes, yes, that's right. Anyone else? Yes, the moderator.
I have also a question. So, as I mentioned before, now we have no subways and very limited number of low-floor buses in the rural areas, and so the only means of transportation is a special means of transportation. But as it was mentioned, the local municipality situations are different. There are those who do have special means of transportation, and there are those who do not. So there's limited mobility, but according to the law, all of the different local municipalities should have the special means of transportation. So, Molit, are you saying that you will have the municipalities implement the special means of transportation? Well, we will be doing an internal review of this with the government subsidies. Well, we are consulting with the ministry in charge of the budget. So we will be reviewing this in an active manner. Can I also add on to that? I have a question as well. Yes, please go on. Well, I have a question to Deputy Director Park.
So, Mr. Park, during commuting time in the morning, do you know that the disabled, they're being criticized a lot because of the protests that we are engaging in the subway stations during the morning commute hours? Well, we are being called devils. There are people who call us devils. They pray to God, asking for the disabled to disappear. So, I mean, you have to try to ensure that we, the disabled members of citizens, will not be criticized and will not be cursed at. So, The first thing that has to be done is to have awareness raising program for the public. Secondly, reflected in the budget so that the right to mobility will be guaranteed. A and B, what is the correct answer? I believe that both are correct. Let me add one thing to that. In the subway stations, we had elevators installed, and the elevator users, what they said was, yes, the subway corporation in Korea, they doing an excellent job. Korea has become a wonderful welfare country. That's what they're saying. So the citizens, they're congratulating the the government. Is this a result of the budget or because of awareness raising campaigns? Well, Mr. Park, you said that the pilot projects will be completed by 2026 and then maybe implemented afterwards. So I think it's the same as asking us to continue to be cursed at for the next 4 years, and it really pains my heart. I really don't want to be criticized by the public. Yes, you are right in pointing that out, and that we really need to look into that further.
Can I continue? Well, I think that we're just raising the questions only to Deputy Director Park, but since he is accommodating all of our questions, you talked about the fourth transportation convenience plan, and you said that MOLIT will be making efforts to reflect our views into that plan.
So the rural areas mobility rights situation and on other issues that remain, yes, I think Chairman Kim Yong-seop and Representative Kim Yong-seop and Representative Im Kyung-mi, what you've mentioned seems to be very important. I think the difference between the rural and urban areas, that's a really outstanding issue. In PyeongChang City, the fact that there is not a single low-floor bus, despite the fact that we're talking about the Paralympic legacy right now, I think that is just so unfortunate. Can you share with us these statistics more? Well, that was the information from Gangwon province. And I believe that their official number is that 2 units are in operation right now. Their transportation department has said that officially there are 2. Well, there is no low floor bus, not a single low floor bus. I think that's quite shocking. So, Mr. Park, in introducing low floor buses, is there a matching between the provincial budget and the central government budget? Do you know? Yes, overall we do try to do it by matching. So there has to be more investments coming from the provinces, right? Well, for PyeongChang City, they have 1 going into low floor buses, excuse me, right now. Is that the situation? Well, yes, that is a problem. We need to look into that further. Yes, so I'm mentioning this because, yes, we have Act amendment, which makes it mandatory. But previously, if there's going to be central government, the local government, and the city government, or the provincial government budget going into it, I mean, it seems that they are blaming each other for the lack of the budget. So I think we need to do some fact finding here to determine who really is responsible. But anyhow, through the amendment, since this has become mandatory, I think we need to really head towards securing enough budget from whatever sources available to implement the details of the amendment. Yes, I will look further into that.
So the moderator is utilizing the AAC to deliver his remarks. There is a question from the floor. Is that to Mr. Park from Molit? Yes, Mr. Park, I have another question for you. So, the director from Seoul City in 2021, there has been an amendment of the law but said that Seoul City is not applicable to this amendment because it's applicable only to at the provincial level. So Seoul City said that this has no change for Seoul City because this is only applicable to the municipalities where the governors reside. So I think that there's some kind of a misunderstanding, but let me look into that. Yes, the time, I think that we're behind schedule, so we have to conclude this session. The special means of transportation and the operation fees for that, if Molit supports this, in that case, doesn't Seoul City also have to support that as well? So Seoul City, Busan City, Gwangju City also, will they be receiving support? Is that under review as well? Can you clarify this? Well, in regards to that, we need to do an internal review on that. So I think I will have to contact you separately. You are Mr. Park Young-seok, right? We will do internal review and I will contact you separately. Yes, contact me by April 6th. Yes, thank you. So we are behind schedule, so we will not have the panelists give concluding remarks. It's time to close. We listened to the 6 people speak, and now we can see that global